Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Rich McDonough, and as I'm coming to you right now in mid-March, we are mercifully making our way out of the woods in terms of the movie industry. More highly anticipated films are being released, more and more theaters are opening up, and I, thankfully, am getting the opportunity to talk about more interesting films. So today I'm going to be talking about a film that is interesting from multiple perspectives, given the uniqueness of its situation, and that is Zack Snyder's Justice League. The director's original version for the film that was meant to launch the DCEU. After that, I'll be taking a look at Operation Varsity Blues, the college admission scandal, which is based on real events about how one man ran a widespread cheating network in order to get wealthy kids into elite universities. Finally, I will be covering the new release, The Courier, which stars Benedict Cumberbatch as a British intelligence agent who needs to uncover information to help prevent the Cuban Missile Crisis. So finally, I have films with lots of talking points and compelling storylines. And be sure to stick around till the end of the show, as due to all the films that are currently losing money due to the pandemic, that got me thinking about what are movies that have lost the most money in terms of their budget compared to their box office. So I will be taking a look at the 10 biggest box office flops of all time. So if you are a fan of sarcasm and bashing people with the benefit of hindsight, definitely stick around till the end of the show. But right now, we are going to start with Zack Snyder's Justice League, which is honestly a film that came about due to people complaining on the internet for it. Due to the largely critical response from audiences on the original Justice League film, that spawned a large campaign to allow Zack Snyder to essentially remake the film and make it closer to the original vision he had for the film. And for those of you who don't know the story, when Zack Snyder was directing the, let's call it the original Justice League film, he tragically lost one of his daughters and had to step away from the project due to obvious reasons. I can only imagine the mental turmoil he was going through at that time. But as the old saying goes, this show must go on, so Warner Brothers brought in Joss Whedon to complete the picture. And Joss Whedon was the man who directed the original 2 Avengers films. So he has a history of working on big-budget superhero movies. So in the eyes of the studio, he was someone that could be trusted with finishing this project. Now, with bringing in a new director, essentially means you have a new person in charge that has a completely different vision of what the movie should be. And for those of you who are familiar with both Zack Snyder's and Joss Whedon's work, you can tell that their styles are very different. Zack Snyder has directed films like 300 and Watchmen, and just visually you can tell that his style is very dark and gritty, along with how he sets the tone for his films, almost to the point of them being gothic. And if you take a look at Joss Whedon's work, it is a bit more optimistic, like the Avengers films. And he was one of the writers of the original Toy Story. So that kind of says all you need to know. So with the original Justice League, you pretty much had one person start the drive, had to switch out halfway through for another person. And those two people had a different idea of the correct route to take to get to the destination. So it's incredibly hard to make a situation like that work and produce an enjoyable product, no matter how good each director is. And I do have to say, just from having seen Justice League, it was a really not great film. The characters were underdeveloped, and the big blow-off was just paint-by-numbers action sequence. There were a few good moments, but overall, it was a very disappointing product. So from the sheer standpoint of seeing what is going to be done differently, this version seems like it's worth checking out. And one thing that has been confirmed about this version of the Justice League, there will be no scenes in it that were shot by Joss Whedon. So this is legitimately only Zack Snyder's Justice League. And it's really interesting just to see all the different ways that people really rallied around Zack Snyder's original version of this film. Patty Jenkins, who directed Wonder Woman, said that she worked with Zack Snyder to make sure that her Wonder Woman film was in keeping with the continuity from Zack Snyder's original idea and not the original theatrical release of the Justice League. And there have, of course, been director's cuts that differ from the theatrical releases of films, but I've never seen any example of a theatrical release just being dismissed straight out of hand by so many people. And it will be interesting to see the precedent that this sets surrounding creative control. And of course, this is an extremely unique situation, but will there be movies going forward where there's a studio version and there's the director's version? Which is just an interesting point to consider. To think about the divide between the creatives actually bringing the film to life and the studio executives on the other end who are making the decisions but ultimately may not be the most creative people or really have an idea of what the audience is going to connect with. And it was reported that when Snyder turned in his first rough cut of the film to executives, they claimed it was unwatchable, which is what initiated them considering Joss Whedon to come in, rewrite the script, and be a part of the reshoots. And there are a lot of other factors that were going on at the time that contributed to this being such a, for lack of a better term, poop show. AT&T had acquired Warner Brothers at this time, and it's reported that studio executives were looking to make sure that the Justice League was released on its intended release date, so they would be eligible for certain bonus checks. It is also reported that Joss Whedon added 80 pages to the script. And to provide some context, a traditional film script usually tops out at about 125 pages, so if he added 80 pages, that's over half the film. This resulted in parts of the movie being literally brighter in terms of the cinematography and lighting used, but also in terms of tone. So there was supposed to be more comedy, less violence, all in attempts to distance itself from the darker tone that Snyder was embarking on. And here we are, oh so many years later, people hated the film that was released, and people are demanding that we get the original version that Zack Snyder began to give us. And given that reportedly 90 minutes of the footage that Snyder had shot up to the point of his exit from the project had been cut out of the film, you can count on this one to be significantly different. And me personally, I'm 100% for that. This was the Justice League movie. Like, the first Avengers film felt like a monumental occasion. It felt like something special was happening. Both in terms of a crossover film that, to that point, audiences had not seen, but also the fact that these classic characters were being brought together on screen for the first time together. The original version of the Justice League really just felt like it was a patched together big studio blockbuster that didn't really have any substance to it. And another thing just regarding the tone of the movie, it just didn't feel like anything meshed together. I can understand why a studio would want a film to have a humorous tone so it can appeal to more audiences and not turn off certain people. But when the main focus of the film is an apocalyptic event where the fate of the world is at stake, and the stakes are literally the extinction of humanity, that is completely undercut by the film's need to have characters cracking a joke every other line. One thing I felt while watching the original was just, none of this matters. There's no stakes here. Whatever threats these characters are facing aren't that significant, and there's no reason to get emotionally invested in the outcome, because it's predetermined as a happy ending. Now, if the Snyder Cut is supposed to have a darker, more grim tone to it, that's going to help engage an audience and make them invested in the characters. If the main heroes of this film are actually beaten down to a low point and they actually have to overcome real obstacles, that's going to make the emotional payoff of the film all the better, without the need to have comic relief every other line just for the sake of keeping the film's tone light and positive. It may not be the worst thing in the world when a film about literally the world coming to an end And the main characters are actually taking that threat seriously. Instead of having a moment where it's like, oh, the Flash is saving some Russian people and he doesn't speak Russian. How hilarious is this moment? And I do get that superhero movies are aimed largely at children, so you can sell that sweet merch. And the Snyder Cut will be rated R as opposed to the original, which was PG-13, but you can still have serious moments in kids' films. I think the first time I ever saw a character die on film was in a Star Wars movie. Didn't do anything to their merchandise sales, so I understand the fact that movies need to please a lot of masters, but the idea that there needs to be a joke to give the audience a moment of brevity in serious moments, I just find ridiculous because it lowers the stakes of what's actually happening on screen. So if the Snyder Cut isn't going to pull any punches in terms of a darker tone or on-screen violence, I think that's a good thing from a narrative perspective when this is a superhero film and the survival of Earth is what is on the line. So I am interested to see this film just to see what Zack Snyder does when he doesn't have a studio executive looking over his shoulder and meddling in his vision. And for those who are also interested in seeing the film, it will be available March 18th via HBO Max. And again, it is weird because essentially this is just a different version of a film that has already come out. So in terms of the cast, it will have the original cast in it, including Henry Cavill as Superman, Gal Gadot as Wonder Woman, Ben Affleck as Batman, Ezra Miller as The Flash, Jason Momoa as Aquaman, and Ray Fisher as Cyborg. So it'll have all those original cast members. Some will actually be given more opportunity to have their backstory told, so they can be more interesting versions of their character. But Zack Snyder's version will also have completely new characters that were not in the original theatrical release, including fan favorite Slade Wilson, who will be played by Joe Manganiello. Ray Porter will be brought in to play Darkseid, the main villain and the popular DC character that Zack Snyder has been teasing throughout his time working on DC films, dating all the way back to his involvement with Man of Steel. And this is probably one of the things audiences were most upset about, was the fact that he did not appear in the theatrical release, given the character had all this build-up and then it wasn't delivered on. And another character that will be appearing in this version will be Jared Leto's Joker. It was originally planned for Zack Snyder to bring together most of the characters in the DCEU over the course of the planned trilogy of Justice League films, but of course, life events change those circumstances. So bringing in Jared Leto's character here is a way of essentially honoring those original plans they had. And to be honest, who doesn't like seeing the Joker in a film? So that will be interesting to see. Another thing that'll be interesting to see will be how Henry Cavill's lip looks in this film. And for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, Henry Cavill had to have a majority of his films reshot by Joss Whedon in order to give the film the lighter tone we discussed earlier. But at the time of reshoots, he was filming a Mission Impossible film that contractually obligated him to keep the mustache he had grown. And because it was mandated that the Justice League meet its original release date, the solution to this was to give him a CGI lip in all his scenes, which resulted in a very awkward looking on-screen product. So hopefully in this version, Henry Cavill looks like a normal human being. And hopefully this version of the Justice League just does what it set out to do. Tell a compelling story, entertain audiences, and for Zack Snyder personally, just give him a level of closure. Once again, I can't imagine what he was going through. It's said that he stayed on the project for 2 months in order to distract himself before it ultimately just became too much. And while I joke about this movie being produced due to a bunch of people on the internet complaining, I think it's really touching in a way that fans of Zack Snyder campaigned to have the studio give him the chance to go back, finish his film, and deliver on his original vision. Now, what does this mean for DCEU films going forward? Who's to say? The original plans of a trilogy have been completely scrapped. The critical response to other DC films, such as Suicide Squad and Wonder Woman 1984, hasn't been as kind. So the studio is really at a crossroads in terms of what they're going to be doing with the DC universe going forward. And to be honest, I kind of hope the whole idea of an interconnected universe kind of doesn't continue. Marvel did it and accomplished amazing things with it, but DC has been playing catch up from Jump Street, and it really just seems like there isn't the same level of vision with DCEU films. So I'm kind of hoping that whatever films they make in the future are self-contained one-offs, kind of like how it is in the comics, where there can be different storylines that don't stick to the continuity that's already been provided. Sure, you can have the same actors playing the same characters across different films, but I think the idea of going back to making individual superhero films that are more concerned about their main character than how this fits into a larger mosaic is gonna do a lot to make audiences engage with these films. And I do hope that you found this conversation engaging. Again, Zack Snyder's Justice League will be available starting March 18th on HBO Max, so definitely check it out. And if you do not have HBO Max, borrow the login from someone you know who has it. I watched Game of Thrones for 3 years because of that method, but that is a story for a different time. So, we're going to take a quick break right now, but coming up, we're going to be discussing the new film, Varsity Blues, the college admission scandal. And be sure to stick around till the end of the show, where we will be diving into the 10 biggest box office flops. So don't go anywhere, and we will be right back on the GSMC Movie Podcast.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Rich McDonough, and I just wrapped up talking about Zack Snyder's Justice League, the director's redemption version to make the film in his original image, which will be available for streaming starting March 18th, exclusively on HBO Max. It is nice to see Zack Snyder getting a second chance to bring audiences the film he intended, and big shout out to anyone who was a part of the Release the Snyder Cut campaign. But right now I want to switch gears into another film, Operation Varsity Blues, the college admission scandal. This film is based on the true events surrounding the college admission scandal that was so high profile, involving people like Felicity Huffman and Lori Loughlin. And this scam was orchestrated by William Singer, where between 2011 and 2018, he falsified college admissions for over 750 families, with schools like Stanford, UCLA, and Yale being implicated in the scandal. And this film goes beyond the headlines that most people saw and really dives into the methods that Singer used to essentially falsify college applications and get children into universities after accepting bribes. And given that inequity is such a hot button issue right now, with people believing the rich can function with impunity and the system is rigged in their favor, while people who weren't born into wealth seemingly have the deck stacked against them in all cases, this film is taking a stance on a very divisive issue. So I'm curious to see the reaction to it, and I'm curious to see how they portrayed these things on the big screen. But once again, the film is Operation Varsity Blues, the college admissions scandal, and it is set for release March 17th on Netflix. So for those of you looking to celebrate St. Patrick's Day in style, you are in luck, because you get to watch the dramatization of the largest college admission fraud case in the nation's history. And I call it a dramatization, but in all honesty, you don't really need to dramatize this story. Like I said, this actually happened, and it seems as though I'm talking about a lot of movies that are based on true events lately, just providing more evidence to the fact that this is the weirdest time to be alive, and the stories that are happening in real life are better than anything anyone can come up with in terms of fiction. So if you're a writer out there, you don't need to know story structure. All you need to do is know how to acquire life rights. And parts of this story sound like they're made up, but once again, life is stranger than fiction. For instance, the term Operation Varsity Blues is not only the title of this film, but it was the name of the investigation the FBI was conducting to uncover this scandal. And for fans of the 1999 film Varsity Blues, that is where they took the name from. But that isn't even the most bizarre aspect to this entire case. Like, for example, they became aware of this scandal in April 2018 when someone named Maury Tobin had been implicated in a pump and dump scandal, which for people who paid attention to the GameStop stock drama will know that it's when the price of a stock is artificially inflated and then sold off before the price seeks its level. In exchange for leniency with that case, Maury Tobin, who is a Yale alumni, offered information that the Yale women's soccer coach, Rudolph Meredith, was involved in this admission scandal, having asked Tobin for $450,000 in order to get his youngest daughter into the school. I'm not really sure how you get leniency on one crime if you're simply telling them about another crime you've done, but Tobin offering up this information is what kicked off the investigation into the college admission scandal. And this story is definitely, worthy of getting an on-screen adaptation. I'm just surprised they condensed this all into one film, because the plot points here make it seem like this could be worth, an entire trilogy of Mafia-style crime drama. But to recap, Maury Tobin gives up the Yale women's soccer coach, Rudolph Meredith, and in turn, Meredith leads the FBI to the one facilitating this entire thing, William Singer. And what this man accomplished in terms of setting up a network of people that were committing fraud on a regular basis, it's truly mind-bending just given the amount of security, the number of parties involved, and scrutiny that goes into the average college application. Yet this one man somehow found the winning formula of how to cheat the system. And clearly there were people more than willing to take advantage of those services he was providing. So to give a little background as to how he pulled this off, he had a foundation called the Key Worldwide Foundation, the Edge College and Career Network. So he was in the business of college admissions to begin with, and he just turned it into a black market. And some of the methods he would use to help kids get into the colleges of their choice would be to help them cheat on the admissions tests, the ACT and the SAT. And he would have a couple different methods of doing this. One, he would go to a psychologist and get a false report saying that the child had a learning disability. In doing this, he would ensure that the child had certain accommodations, and for example, this would be having extra time on a test. Singer would later reveal that he could acquire one of these for between $4,000 and $5,000. So, money talks apparently. But another thing he would do, and this just speaks to the sheer lunacy in terms of lack of oversight that is going on with college admissions, he had testing sites that were under his control. So he would have families travel to those locations, which are listed as West Hollywood or Houston, so far as to fabricate family events that were going on, as to explain why they were there at that time. But the guy who is rigging the test is the one that has complete control over the testing site. And one of the crazier details of this method he would use to get kids into college, some of the kids didn't even know what was going on. In some cases, the kids would just be taking the test, thinking this is the normal way that a kid takes the ACT or SAT, and have no knowledge of what was going on in the background. But in these cases, the kids would take the test, and then the test would be altered later by the people administering it. So there's just all sorts of levels of deception going on in this thing. In other cases, there would be a stand-in test taker. One of these stand-in test takers was Mark Riddle, who is a Harvard alumnus and actually worked as a college admission test preparation director. So in this case, you have someone whose job it is to prepare kids for a test, so he clearly knows everything about it. He has an IQ that probably matches his weight, and he's being paid $10,000 every single time he sits in for a student on the test. I just think it's crazy that this can happen in a testing environment. When I was taking the SAT, there was a woman proctoring the exam. There was a kid saying, I have to go throw up. She said, if you leave, you can't come back. All of a sudden, the kid didn't have to throw up. We need more stern women like that in the college admission testing world. But those would be the tactics that Singer used to cheat the testing. And when asked about using these methods, he would say these aren't even that uncommon outside of his scheme. Parents will falsify documents saying their kid has a learning disability in order to get them more time on a test, simply so they can just have all the time they need and get the best score possible. Which I don't know how it's allowed, given that part of the test is being able to perform in a certain amount of time. But apparently this tactic is rampant when it comes to college admissions tests. Now, some other methods that Singer used to get kids into these colleges, and this is probably what most people are more familiar with, given that it was a big story in the news, is falsifying athletic credentials and saying kids are coming to a school to do a sport, so they get a letter of admission. The time comes, they're still admitted to the school, but they've decided, I don't see myself doing college athletics. And this aspect is where the real complex crimes came in, because he would use his foundation, the Key Worldwide Foundation, as a way to launder money for the bribes that he would pay these coaches. And these coaches would be paid to put certain kids on the list of recruits that they would hand into the admissions office saying, these are the kids we're looking at for next season. And in doing so, those kids' applications would essentially go to the front of the line. Because, as with many college athletic programs, that brings in a lot of money for the school, whether it's through selling tickets to the events, merchandising, or donations from alumni. There is just that natural incentive to have colleges make special accommodations for its athletes. And things went so far in this method of faking the child's way into school that parents would literally Photoshop pictures of their kids' heads onto other athletes. And this method of getting kids into school is probably what garnered the most public attention when this whole scandal was discovered, because this is the method that actress Lori Loughlin used to get her kids into USC. Lori Loughlin, who everyone probably knows from Full House as Aunt Becky, her and her husband paid $500,000 to get her two daughters recruited to USC as rowers. And her daughters probably got the most attention of any of the students in this scandal, not only because their mother was famous, but because one of them, Olivia Jade, was already a prominent social media influencer at this time, and one piece of content that kept playing throughout the time of this scandal breaking is her on her YouTube channel saying she is pretty much only in college for tailgating, and she doesn't care about class. And that's just a great message to send when you are at a school you don't deserve to be at, and you're not even taking advantage of the opportunity that you have. So that girl really became a lightning rod for all the hate over this admission scandal. And the school she was at, USC, probably had the most intricate operation in this scandal, given that the assistant athletic director, Donna Hino, was involved in it. So from her position, she was able to manipulate a lot of sports recruitment lists. But it's just crazy to think that this could happen at a place like USC. And USC wasn't by any means the only place this was happening. Places like Georgetown, Stanford, UCLA, University of San Diego, University of Texas, Wake Forest, and even a place like Yale had this going on. And it's not like actresses like Lori Loughlin and Felicity Huffman were the only people involved in this. Douglas Hodge, the former CEO of PIMCO, which is the largest bond managing company in the world. And when someone in a position like that is involved in something like this, where there's the level of unethical behavior going on, and essentially believing that you can buy your way to anything you want, it makes you wonder if someone like that is willing to do this to get his kid into college, what is he willing to do in his own business ventures? Which again is something that is such a major issue in America right now. There are people that believe that because they have money, they can get away with whatever they want, and the rest of the population needs to play by the rules and not make a fuss about it. So to see how Operation Varsity Blues is going to portray this issue is going to be really compelling to see. And I know that it feels like I pretty much just gave a news report on the college admissions scandal. This is all to set the scene for the movie that's coming out about these events. And this movie is really a unique blend of storytelling because it has Matthew Modine playing William Singer, and he is going to be reenacting actual conversations that were recorded, William Singer having with people that were eliciting his services, but it's also a documentary where they're just flat out going to be presenting the information and showing you how far this rabbit hole really went. And it is pretty ridiculous how he was able to, in the film's own words, create these side doors into college where he can essentially guarantee, for the right price, your kid will get into this college. Which I'm sure is such a disturbing thought for so many people who see going to college as a way not only to change their life, but to make sure that their family going forward is going to be taken care of. And here comes this guy who essentially is saying, for the right price, you can bypass all of that. And for something like being accepted to college, where it's really supposed to be only on your merit, and you're supposed to be judged as purely an individual, in these cases, all that really mattered was whether or not mom and dad's check cleared. So me personally, I'm really looking forward to watching this, to not only get a better understanding of this entire scandal, but to find out the repercussions for a lot of this. There are so many more minor players that were involved that I wasn't even aware of. I'm interested to see what happens to them. I'm interested to see the finer details of how this whole scandal was uncovered. And I want to see the stance the filmmakers take on it and what they say on such a divisive issue. So once again, the film is Operation Varsity Blues, the college admissions scandal, the hybrid dramatization of actual events that occurred, and this film is set for release this St. Patrick's Day, March 17th, and will be available exclusively on Netflix, so be sure to check it out. But right now, here on the GSMC Movie Podcast, we're going to be taking a quick break. But be sure to not go anywhere, because coming up, we will be talking about the new spy thriller, The Courier, starring Benedict Cumberbatch as a British intelligence agent who needs to uncover information to help prevent the Cuban Missile Crisis. And be sure to stick around till the very end of the show, as looking around, seeing all these movies being released into theaters and not getting the full opportunity to make some box office, and studios having to take losses because of that, it got me wondering, what are some movies that lost a ton of money when they didn't have a pandemic to deal with? So, I'll be taking a look at the 10 biggest box office bombs that debuted outside of a pandemic, and we'll be having some laughs at their expense. So don't go anywhere, we'll be right back on the GSMC Movie Podcast.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
To the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Rich McDonough, and I just finished talking about the new Netflix hybrid film documentary, Operation Varsity Blues, the college admissions scandal. And this details the events that actually happened where one man, William Singer, had this elaborate network set up to help get kids into the school of their choice, as long as their parents would pay the appropriate amount. This film is covering an incredibly compelling story, and it will be interesting to see the stance the filmmakers took on the subject. For those interested in viewing it, it will be available starting March 17th, exclusively on Netflix, so be sure to check it out. But right now, we're going to be shifting into talking about another film based on true events, and that is The Courier, starring Benedict Cumberbatch. This film details the story of how a businessman named Greville Wynne was recruited into an espionage effort during the Cuban Missile Crisis in order to uncover some information that could help stave off the conflict. This film is set for release March 19th, and it will be playing in theaters. And this is a spy thriller set at a time when spying and espionage were actual practices. I'm sure they are today, but to this level, I'm not sure we'll ever see anything like the efforts made by countries like America and England, specifically in this film, to infiltrate the USSR. And that is what the film The Courier details, just the lengths that intelligence agencies were willing to go to in that time. The main character, Greville Wynne, was just a salesman who would make business trips to Eastern Europe, and all of a sudden, MI6 is recruiting him to make a sales call to Moscow. And in real life, Wayne would make contact with men called Oleg Penkovsky, and these two men would set up a communication channel where they would pass information about the Soviet Union to the West, with Wayne acting as the person physically relaying this information, hence the title, The Courier. But these two men were doing incredibly risky things at a time when the penalty for doing something like this was incredibly dangerous. And not to give any plot points away for people that want to go into the film fresh, but the penalty for espionage at that time was very severe. This was the absolute height of the Cold War. America and Russia, the two superpowers at that time, each having an arsenal of nuclear weapons and each trying to discover what the other side was up to. So when it came down to protecting those secrets and ensuring that information was not falling into enemy hands, both sides were incredibly protective of state secrets. And that really is what makes this story of a run-of-the-mill businessman so remarkable, that without possessing this spy background, he was co-opted into an operation to unearth sensitive information. And what Wayne did was incredibly brave. Here is essentially this average Joe who is recruited into playing a part in one of the most decisive conflicts in recent history. And in an interview with Tara Hitchcock, that's what Benedict Cumberbatch said drew him to this role in the first place. The fact that this was just a run-of-the-mill guy. Also revealing that the real-life Greville Wynne was dyslexic to the point of being illiterate. And then one day he is just brought into a world that he has no control over and is so much larger than himself, which Cumberbatch says is the part of this character that everyone can relate to, of him just being an average Joe who is in over his head in terms of his circumstances, which Cumberbatch says is clearly applicable to the pandemic we're all dealing with, but it is also common in everyday life. Now, most people aren't dealing with having to spy on a rival nation, but I'm sure everyone can think of an example in their life when they're asked to do something they feel incredibly unprepared to do. And in the same interview I was referencing earlier, Cumberbatch essentially says that's the message of the film, is that despite people feeling unprepared or even unworthy of an opportunity presented to them, you should not shy away from it, and you really need to muster up the courage in order to see that task through to completion. If Greville Wynne had not done this incredibly brave thing, who's to say where the West would have been in terms of gathering information on the Soviets? And I don't want to go too far into the details surrounding Wayne's work so as not to spoil the movie for anyone, but again, it was at the absolute height of the Cold War, and him and Penkovsky were relaying information about the USSR during the early 60s. And in doing research for this podcast, I was thinking this is a story that is being trumped up to be bigger than it is, as British filmmakers have a habit of doing. But this story sounds like the real deal, and it seems as though that these two men really did a lot to tip off intelligence agencies about the impending Cuban Missile Crisis. Which, to give people a quick history lesson for the sake of just being consistent, this happened in October of 1962, and it's where the Soviet Union were going to place nuclear missiles on Cuba's shore, because commies have to stick together. And this resulted in JFK having to blockade the island nation of Cuba. Now, I'm not sure the exact information that Greville and Oleg were relaying, But if it was information relating to these missiles being delivered to Cuba, and them tipping off the British and U.S. intelligence agencies contributed to Kennedy blockading Cuba, that is incredibly valuable information and contributed to helping de-escalate one of the most tense conflicts in world history. The world was pretty much on the precipice of nuclear war for a week before a resolution could be reached. And if they didn't get this information about the missiles into the right hands at the right time, history could have played out very differently. And in addition to being able to play an everyman hero, Cumberbatch said he was drawn to the role because it examines history. He does have a penchant for historical films, including appearing in The Imitation Game in 1917, and he says that what draws him to these movies is there are constantly lessons to be learned from historical events. And as people living today, we constantly need to be taking a look back and learning from those lessons that can teach us about how to deal with situations we're facing today. And that idea that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they have the opportunity to. And in his interviews about the film, Cumberbatch references the pandemic we're in, the climate crisis, and references people such as Greta Thunberg or even faceless people that are just cleaning out the ward of a hospital. Everyone can find an opportunity to contribute to finding the ultimate solution. And that's what Greville Wynne did when the opportunity presented himself. He did something incredibly brave, putting his own life at risk, all in an attempt to stop these two superpowers at the time from causing mutual destruction. And if we do what Benedict Cumberbatch is asking for, which is to take a look back at history to find the lessons and apply them to modern day occurrences, the world is clearly divided on major issues, and as things become more polarizing, the less likely people are to try to meet in the middle. We can take a look back at the time period the Courier is set in, where the stakes at that time were literally human extinction, and hopefully the issues we're facing nowadays aren't that consequential and extreme, but taking a look at the value of compromise and the role it played in something like the Cuban Missile Crisis, hopefully will give people a reason to see things from a different point of view and not simply seal themselves in their echo chamber, as people are apt to do nowadays. So causing people to look back at historical events and re-examine the importance of certain actions is why Benedict Cumberbatch is so drawn to starring in historical films. But with the Courier in particular, when he heard the story, he was really eager to not only be a part of it, he wanted to help produce it. The director, Dominic Cooke, approached him with this project, and the two had previously worked together on The Hollow Crown, in which Benedict Cumberbatch played Richard III, and he was eager to work with Dominic Cooke again, but the story of just this, again, an everyman who takes on this unimaginable task of being an intelligence agent really spoke to him, and he thought that this is something that other people need to see. So much so that he wasn't just content with being in it, he wanted to be one of the producers. Because he really just believed in bringing this story of ordinary heroism to a broader audience, and he really believes that this is a tremendous example of no matter how powerless or ordinary you think you are, you can take action that can have a tremendous effect on the greater good and society as a whole. And again, he says this film is very poignant, not because it captures the issues that were going on at the time and the fear that people had at this point in time with just the uncertainty of nuclear war and that essentially hanging over their heads, but he believes that it's very poignant because of the things we're dealing with now, whether that be the pandemic or just the multitude of issues the planet is facing at the time. So this film is doing a lot. A, it's serving as a gripping spy thriller. B, it's encapsulating the incredibly brave job that this man, Greville Wynne, was doing at the time, essentially risking his life time and time again for the greater good. And as I've stated time and time again, it is telling the story that no matter how unprepared or ill-equipped you think you are for an opportunity where you could have an impact that is larger than yourself, it's within all of us to really summon up the courage and execute under that pressure. And Cumberbatch is right in the fact that that is a very poignant message at the time, given that we are all dealing with something that we cannot control. But we are pretty lucky that the actions that we can take are simply wearing a mask, keeping our distance, and washing our hands to have a positive impact on this whole event. Now, when you compare that to running back and forth between Moscow during the Cold War, all while trying to communicate sensitive information to British and US intelligence agencies, pumping a few more squirts of Purell doesn't seem so inconvenient anymore. But the real-life story of Greville Wynne is unbelievable, and for those of you interested in seeing it, The Courier again will be released March 19th and will be playing in theaters. And like many films set for release over the past year or so, this one had a real long journey in getting to theaters. It actually made its world premiere last year at the Sundance Film Festival in January, and it even debuted under a different title. This film was originally called Iron Bank, which, to give a little context to, Iron Bank was the codename of his Russian contact, Oleg Penkovsky. And to recap the film, this is pretty much the story of their relationship and how they formed this information channel that would relay information out of Moscow to British and US intelligence agencies. And the main character, Greville Wynne, was just a run-of-the-mill guy, and that's why he was selected, because they were of the opinion he was someone that would not arouse suspicion if he was traveling to Moscow under the guise of making sales and opening new business avenues. So if you are a fan of the spy thriller, if you are a fan of historical fiction, there are definitely compelling reasons to check out The Courier, and I highly encourage you to do so. And again, this film stars Benedict Cumberbatch in the lead of Greville Wynne. It also stars Rachel Brosnahan, who most people will recognize as the titular character in The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. Jessie Buckley will be starring opposite Benedict Cumberbatch as his wife's character, Sheila Wynne. And Mirad Nidnidzin will be playing the role of Oleg Penkovsky. The director of the film, once again, is Dominic Cook. And after over a year of being delayed, this film is finally making its way to theaters, so be sure to check it out. But right now, we're going to be taking a break on the GSMC Movie Podcast, but be sure to stick around as we are going to be going into the top 10 box office bombs of all time. And the reason my interest was piqued at this topic is just because over the past year, there have been so many films that have either bombed at the box office or not even had a chance to make it to the box office. And the reason for this is obvious: COVID-19 pandemic. It feels weird even having to reference that at this point. It really should just be common knowledge. But there have been a lot of films that were expected to do big numbers at the box office, and studios were expecting these films to lead to a massive payday. But because of the events that transpired, theaters had to close, studios had to pivot on the fly, and films that were expected to be released in theaters either had to be altogether delayed, some shoots actually got shut down, and others had to be released via streaming platforms. And all these factors led to 2020 just being the most unique year there had ever been for the box office. Of course, there were extenuating circumstances, but for the first time after 5 straight years of posting worldwide revenue above $11 billion, the theater industry totaled its worst year in terms of revenue since the early 80s. And just in taking a look at all these films that had so much invested in them, had so much work poured into them, and through no fault of their own, they were not given a fair opportunity to make any money. Essentially, every movie released in 2020 lost money, and I think it just robs the filmmakers of an opportunity to leave their mark on an audience. Now, on the flip side of that, I thought it would be entertaining to take a look back at films that had major money poured into them, debuted when there was not a worldwide pandemic, and the filmmakers really have no excuse as to why their films performed so poorly. To give you a quick preview of this, there isn't a single one of these films that I'm going to talk about that didn't lose at least $90 million at the box office. And there are some terrible films to be talked about, so don't go anywhere. On the other side of the break, we'll be diving into the 10 biggest box office bombs of all time. So be sure to stick around.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blanks and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome back into the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Rich McDonough, and I just finished talking about The Courier, the new spy thriller starring Benedict Cumberbatch as a British intelligence agent who needs to uncover information to help prevent the Cuban Missile Crisis. This spy thriller will be released March 19th. And luckily for this film, it is being released in a time where theaters are open and it can be in front of audiences and rake in some box office. But since taking a look at all the films that are losing money due to the pandemic, it got me thinking about what are some films that have lost the most money when times are good. So that's what I'm going to be talking about in this segment, and counting down the top 10 films that have lost the most money. And in this segment, I am just going to be dealing with the raw amount, no adjusted for inflation, and I'm not going to be including films that have been released in the pandemic because they obviously don't have the opportunity to make back box office. But I will give you a few examples of those types of films in the honorable mentions section. First off is the live-action adaptation of Mulan that was released last year. This film cost $200 million, and in terms of box office, only made back little over $51 million. So in terms of budget compared to box office, this film lost $148,862,899, which is the all-time record for money lost at the box office. Now, of course, that total doesn't factor in how many people paid for it on Disney Plus Premium Access. So going forward, there will have to be a new record-keeping system that accounts for movies released via streaming. Another offering from the House of Mouse that was released during the pandemic was the movie Onward, which starred Tom Holland and Chris Pratt as a pair of fairy brothers. Okay, maybe more than the pandemic kept people from watching that in theaters. But when all was said and done, the film still ended up losing $135,416,704. So of the movies that have lost the most total money, the ones I just shared with you are 2 out of the top 3. And one more honorable mention I want to throw in. It's been knocked off given that movie budgets are through the roof nowadays, and the budget of anything made now really just dwarfs anything prior to 15 years ago. The Adventures of Pluto Nash starring Eddie Murphy. Since its release, it may have morphed into one of those things where it's so bad it's good, but at the time of release, its budget was $125 million, and it didn't even make back $11 million. But luckily for that movie and Eddie Murphy, I have a list of 10 movies that had much bigger budgets and made a lot less money. So let's get into it. The top 10 box office bombs of all time. And like I said, this list is based off of solely the raw total amount lost on a film. So maybe I'll have to do another list about lowest return on investment for a film. But let's get it started with number 10, and that is the film The Promise. Released in 2017, this film is a love triangle film about a journalist who meets a woman during the fall of the Ottoman Empire. This woman has a boyfriend, and thus a romantic rivalry ensues. My question there is, why did this film cost just under $100 million to make? I understand having stars in it like Oscar Isaac and Christian Bale can get expensive, but this sounds like a movie that is fairly generic and shouldn't be that high ticket to make. In the end, this film lost $93 million $651,362. And I don't understand the excuse for this film grossing so little money. It debuted in April of 2017, and the most popular movie out at that time was The Smurfs. When you're getting crushed by a bunch of little blue communists, something's wrong with your film. But let us move on to number 9, and that is Jupiter Ascending. I remember seeing trailers for this film, and it was just like, this movie looks terrible. One of those generic, a bunch of CGI and a whole bunch of nothing behind it. It was written and directed by the Wachowskis and was supposed to be a cross between The Matrix and Star Wars. Ended up doing a whole bunch of none of that. To be fair, it was praised for having a strong female character in a sci-fi film, which was very much outside the norm. And who knows, maybe that influenced Daisy Ridley being cast in the lead of the new Star Wars franchise. But unlike Star Wars, this film lost $95,796,494. How do studios just have this money? My God, give me $1 million and I'm sure I could produce something halfway decent. But anyway, Jupiter Ascending, the 8th biggest box office bomb outside of pandemic times. And number 7 is 47 Ronin. For those unfamiliar with the film, it stars Keanu Reeves as a samurai. And this is one of the films that really kicked off the movement of why is Hollywood whitewashing so many characters. And I do know that in his personal life, Keanu Reeves is really into martial arts, so I can understand why this film would appeal to him. But when you're making a movie about the tradition of the samurai and avenging the death of your master to restore honor to your clan, maybe let people that actually have ties to that culture be the ones telling the story. And while it did rake in $94 million at the box office, its net loss was $96,209,169. So 47 Ronin comes in at number 7. Coming in at number 6 is Jack the Giant Slayer, which was the live-action adaptation of Jack and the Beanstalk, the classic fairy tale for children. And let's get the obvious joke out of the way. It had a giant budget of $228,504,000, which actually gives it the second highest budget on this list. But like in the story, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. And this film ended up costing its studio $102,872,972. It's just crazy to think that a movie that makes $125 million can be considered a failure. And this film even had a terrific cast. Nicholas Hoult, Eleanor Tomlinson, Stanley Tucci, Ian McShane, Bill Nighy, and Ewan McGregor were in it. All that for a story about a kid climbing up a beanstalk. And coming in at number 6, the film that falls just outside the top 5 biggest box office bombs of all time is How Do You Know? And this is another film I saw on the bus ride to hell. If you listened to my last episode about the movie Trust, you'll remember I told a story about how I was stuck on a bus essentially watching rom-coms for 5 hours. So I unfortunately have seen this movie. It also has a fairly good cast. Reese Witherspoon, Owen Wilson, Paul Rudd, and Jack Nicholson. And it was actually his last film role. Man, I hope he does something else. It's even directed by James L. Brooks. He co-created The Simpsons. This movie has no right to be as bad as it was. But I will give it credit for one of the most hilariously ignorant lines I've ever heard. Owen Wilson's character plays a baseball player, and he's talking about how do you know when you're in love. The guys on his team are trying to explain to him how you know. One of them says the line, "I know I'm in love when I start using condoms with the other girls." And I think that line by itself is just hilarious. But back to the numbers, this film lost over $104,301,344. Simply stunning. But getting into the top 5 biggest box office bombs of all time, we have the film Monster Trucks. So this was a Nickelodeon movie, and you can't expect too much of it right off the bat. I'm pretty sure those people gave the Fred kid a trilogy. But this movie is about a monster that feeds on oil, befriending a young auto mechanic, and the monster likes to hide inside the chassis of the car. And they spend the movie on the run from a fracking company. And I'm willing to cut some of these films like some slack for not performing well at the box office, but it's no surprise that this one lost $109,284,852. Just because a movie is aimed at kids doesn't mean it can be terrible. Next up on the list is one of Mark Wahlberg's many flops, and that is Deepwater Horizon, the dramatization of the 2010 oil spill. Now, that was the largest oil spill in American history, so it's understandable why a studio would think there would be an audience for it, but when it comes down to it, it just did not draw in audiences, losing $112,573,514. So Marky Mark and the Funky Bunch take a loss on that one. But moving into the top 3 biggest box office bombs of all time, we have King Arthur and the Legend of the Sword. Now, King Arthur is a classic tale, and anyone looking for a long, exhaustive philosophical book to read, I suggest The Once and Future King by T.H. White, which is the story of King Arthur. And it doesn't make sense as to why a studio would want to bring such a classic tale to the big screen. There had been many iterations of it before, including the 2004 film King Arthur and the 1981 film Excalibur, but unlike those previous iterations, this one fell flat on its face. With a budget of almost $200 million, this film was supposed to capitalize on the medieval craze that was going on, with shows like Game of Thrones being at the height of its popularity. King Arthur, Legend of the Sword, failed to do so, and as a result, lost $112,916,100. But to be fair, it looks a million times better than the one they made for children, King Arthur, the Kid Who Would Be King. But unfortunately, it takes the number 3 spot on the biggest box office bombs of all time. In the penultimate position of number 2, we have the science fiction flop, John Carter. And what happened to John Carter, I feel, is just a case of bad timing. It is based off a book that came out in 1913, so the story told is one of the very earliest examples of science fiction, but by the time it was adapted to the big screen, it just looked like a ripoff of everything we'd already seen before. Visually, it looked a lot like one of the Star Wars prequel films, with a sand planet and the protagonist having to fight a monster in a stadium. And the film marketed itself as John Carter is this big deal. But for people unfamiliar with the books, we have no idea who this is. What's the point of investing in him? So this was another film at the time. I just saw it and thought, this is going to bomb. And to be fair to John Carter, it has made the most money of any other movie on this list, with $182,268,948. But when you take into consideration the budget was $295,824,000, that's a net loss of over $13 million. So John Carter has lost the second most amount of money at the box office, but we can give it the title of the most successful box office bomb. I guess that's some sort of consolation prize. But luckily for that film, there is one movie that has performed even worse at the box office. This movie lost a non-COVID record of $143,412,576, and that is Mars Needs Moms. The film based around Martians coming to Earth and stealing a boy's mother, therefore giving him a larger appreciation for her, is the largest net loss of any film released outside of a pandemic, and is just another example of just because a movie is made for kids doesn't mean it can be bad. And for those of you out there who need a good laugh, I highly encourage you to go check out the trailer for this film, because there is an original rap song about Mars needing mothers. But there you have it, the 10 biggest box office bombs of all time. And to give you a recap, we have at number 10 The Promise, which made the least amount of money of any movie on this list, with just over $6 million. Then we have Jupiter Ascending, 47 Ronin, Jack the Giant Slayer, How Do You Know?, Monster Trucks, Deepwater Horizon, King Arthur, Legend of the Sword, John Carter, and Mars Needs Moms. Now, I'm not here to say these films are bad, but in terms of box office, they just did not bring in the audiences. And to really just drive this home, these films cost approximately $1,869,782,000 to make, which is larger than the GDP of some countries. And in terms of total losses, these films lost over $1.8 $84,573,436. It is just crazy to think about just the stupid amounts of money that are thrown around to make films. But hopefully you have enjoyed me hurling insults at movie studios and producers that made films that audiences outright rejected. It was fun taking a look at these films, and I may even take a look at a few of them just for a good laugh. But that will pretty much do it for this episode of the GSMC Movie Podcast. Be sure to tune in next episode, as by that time we will know who is nominated for the Academy Awards. So I will be diving into all of that, in addition to, of course, taking a look at some other films that are making their debut. But for now, I once again want to thank everybody who is listening to the GSMC Movie Podcast, which is brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. And I want to remind everybody, if they have not already, to be sure to subscribe to the show and be sure to leave us a nice review. That really helps us a lot. You really don't know how much that helps us. And be sure to check us out on social media, including Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. For now, I've been Richard McDonough, and I will see you next time.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.